Can everyone hear me? Let's see. Let me see. Let me change. Let me see. Good. Okay. Let's see. Do I have an announcement? Oh, don't forget today's extra credit panel. We're getting pretty close to the end of the semester, believe it or not. I think we're, 4 weeks away from the end of the semester, something like that. It's getting pretty close. So for some of you, right, who are seniors, this is the home stretch. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? And it's not a train. It really is the exit. So congratulations, but you want to end strong, right? This is it, the home stretch. For some of you, this will be your last month of formal education, and then you'll have just a lot of life education moving forward. What else was I going to say? Did I give everyone the Sal's email address? I don't remember anymore. Everything's sort of blurry. Yes, it is. It is crazy. And this last month's going to really fly by. Well, for me, every year, April through June just seems like a blur every year. You know what they say, right? Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but as you get older, time goes by faster. I think that's true. No, I don't think you gave us. I didn't. No? Okay, I have to forward you Sal's email. My bad. Um, what else was I going to say? I thought he gave it to you, but that's okay. I'll give it to you anyways. All right. So I believe this is where we left off, um, talking about sports. And so I think I already talked about baseball. I got all the way through it. And so let's start talking about the NFL, the National Football League, or as I like to say, America's second religion, because we love football. And so the first person that is really important to the NFL is Joseph Carr. And Joseph Carr is really considered to be the father. So he is the father of professional football. He really was, the first president, I should say. I don't think they had commissioners. First real president of professional football. He is the guy who under his watch, the NFL created the idea of divisions. So, you have, I don't know how many of you are sports fans, but the idea of creating different divisions. So you have a division in the West. You may have a division in the Midwest. Then you may have a division in the East, for example. So the idea of divisions happened under Joseph Carr. He also was the guy who started the idea, or under him, the idea of playoffs started. So again, playoffs to determine who is going to be the champion every year. It used to be, at least the early part of the NFL, whoever had the best record was quote unquote the champion. And then under Joseph Carr, the NFL started to create, again, the idea of divisions. And then the winners of these divisions would play against each other in a playoff game to determine the champions. So also under Joseph Carr, the idea of moving teams from small cities to big cities started. So the early part of the NFL, a lot of the NFL teams were in these small little tiny towns, primarily in Ohio and primarily in Pennsylvania. And so Joseph Carr's idea was we need to get these teams out of these small cities or small towns and move them into bigger cities, like move them into cities like Chicago or Pittsburgh or New York. And the idea was that if you can move a team into a bigger city, you had a bigger fan base, And so you would have a bigger following if you moved the team from a small town to a big city. And also, one last thing about Joseph Carr, he also was under his watch, the NFL stopped drafting college players. So under his watch, the NFL stopped drafting NFL players. And the reason there was this gigantic controversy was, if you see down here, the third person, Red Grange. Red Grange was one of the first NFL stars, and he was drafted by George Halas, the second guy. He was drafted by George Halas, who was the owner of the Chicago Bears. And that created a lot of controversy because Red Grange was still in college. And so Joseph Carr decided, well, this is bad publicity, and we're no longer going to draft college players until after they graduate from college. And so the idea of players finishing college, or at least not being drafted until their college class graduates, really started with Joseph Carr. Any questions about Joseph Carr, the father of professional football? The guy who helped to set the foundation for making the sport gigantic and big and popular. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a quick video about George Halas. And George Halas, the importance of George Halas, really was the first famous head coach, and really the first great promoter of the NFL. He worked alongside with Joseph Carr, so from the early days of the NFL. And so this is a little bit about George Halas, who again is the owner, I don't think I mentioned it, the owner of the Chicago Bears, and was the owner of Chicago Bears for quite a long time.
The Chicago Bears are the NFL's flagship franchise. Their storied history dates back 100 years to 1920, and the man whose initials to this day remain emblazoned on the left sleeve of their uniform, George Stanley Halas.
Going back to the beginning of the Bears in Decatur, Illinois, my dad was approached to work for the Staley Starch Company and play on the team and manage and coach. He was partnered with Dutch Sterneman. They were co-coaches and also players.
Always the visionary, it was Halas who represented the team, then known as the Decatur Staleys, at the organizational meeting of the American Professional Football Association. The group later changed its name to the National Football League.
There were 11 teams represented. And in order to join this group, you had to put up $100 for a franchise. I think it's worth a little more than that now.
In 1921, Halas and Sterneman moved the team to Chicago, where a year later they changed the name to the Bears. To succeed, Halas knew the fledgling league needed star power. He found it in the form of the galloping ghost, Red Grange.
We signed them, need fuel to capacity in every instance. It was a great addition to our league.
Halas continued to make headlines, signing Patty Driscoll in 1926, the NFL's first all-pro quarterback.
That Patty Driscoll, he was a great player, great passer, great runner.
Players like Driscoll and Grange, victories and championships helped the Bears finish the 1920s as the young league's marquee franchise.
So that's a little bit about George Halas. The other thing that George Halas created that's still used in the NFL, by the way, by coaches, the idea of practice, the idea of daily practice. It wasn't a thing in the early days of football. It started with George Halas, this idea of essentially having practice for its players. And also the idea of calling plays from up in the stadium. A lot of that comes from George Halas. The idea of studying film comes from George Halas. There's a guy who comes along later named Paul Brown who takes it to a different level. But George Halas is really the guy who set the foundation in terms of like daily practice again, studying film, having plays called from the top of the stadium so he can call better plays, those sorts of things. Anyways, Red Grange. So Red Grange was the first NFL star. They used to call him the Galloping Ghost. He played for the University of Illinois. And the reason they called him the Galloping Ghost was because, well, you couldn't tackle him. He was really fast. He was a really fast runner. It felt like you were tackling a ghost because you would dive or reach to grab him, and he was no longer there. He was gone. And so he really was the first NFL star. George Halas created a barnstorming tour, going back to the idea of George Halas being a great promoter. Is anybody familiar with the idea of barnstorming? Do you guys know what I mean by barnstorming? All right, fair enough. Barnstorming. So barnstorming essentially would be he would have games. He would schedule. George Halas would schedule games throughout the country. It was kind of like a barnstorming tour. You got to think of it kind of like an sort of like a modern day concert tour, but in this case it was football games or baseball games. And so he would barnstorm, in other words, have these games or exhibitions, and he would schedule them throughout the country. As a matter of fact, you're right, the Chicago Bears even played a game here at the LA Coliseum. And so the Bears would travel around the country and play these exhibition games or real games. And they used to call that barnstorming. And really, people would come from all over to watch Red Grange, and he would sell out these gigantic stadiums. And he really was the person that really indicated to the rest of the owners that this idea of football could become a big deal. Because at the time, football was not a big deal. It was not considered very important. It was probably maybe the third or fourth most popular sport at the time, behind boxing, behind baseball, and heck, even behind college football. And so Red Grange and the fact that he attracted so many people on these barnstorming tours really was an indicator that the NFL could become a big deal moving forward if you had a star player. And so again, he was a running back for a period of time. Then he injured his knee and ended up becoming a safety. Red Grange also became the first broadcaster to first person to successfully transition from being an athlete to broadcaster, and also the first football player to appear on a Wheaties box. Just, side note. So the 1958 championship. Let's see if there's any questions. Oh, I've not heard of it. Isn't like a tour where you basically go around and that's exactly right, Jacob. Yeah, it's a tour where we basically show off. That's right. You're absolutely 100% correct. The Negro League Stars would play against the Major League Baseball All-Stars, and they would also do like a barnstorming tour. This is a baseball example. And they would have exhibitions throughout the country, and they would play against each other during the off season to generate more money, but also, as you would say, Jacob, to show off. And in most cases, by the way, the Negro League Stars would beat the Major League Stars. But unfortunately, if you heard the clip on Major League Baseball, Kevin Kennesaw Mountain Landis and the rest of the owners didn't want to integrate the league, unfortunately, for no good reason, mind you. Again, that was just a gentleman's agreement. Anyways, back to football, not to go off on a tangent with baseball. So the 1958 NFL championship really is the turning point for the NFL. And it was a championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. So again, this is the turning point for NFL football. And the game ends up going into overtime. People didn't really know, not even the players knew, okay, what was going to happen? Is it going to end up in a tie? What do we do here? And so the game ends up going into overtime. And I'll show you the clip about who wins. But the game, right, ends up capturing the imagination of the public. And so many people point to this one game as being sort of the springboard to the NFL's popularity moving forward. I mean, there'll be other factors as well that we'll talk about. But the NFL championship game, as many point to, as that's the moment where the NFL really captures the hearts and minds of the public. So here's a little bit about the 1958 NFL championship. Oh no, they don't let me watch it. Oh well, I'll go back. I hate the NFL sometimes. They're so protective about their property. Anyway, so now I'll just tell you the ending. So the Giants were basically winning most of the game, and the Baltimore Colts come back, and the Baltimore Colts end up winning the game in overtime. And so again, the Baltimore Colts end up winning the game in overtime. The 1958 NFL championship game is often referred to as the greatest game ever played. So again, it's often referred to as the greatest game ever played. Was it the greatest game ever played? Well, I don't know. I've seen better games, but hey, whatever. So Pete Rozelle. So Pete Rozelle takes over the NFL in 1960. Pete Rozelle is a super young guy. He's, I think, in his early 30s when he takes over the league. If you don't know about his history, Pete Rozelle was a great NFL commissioner. He actually grew up in Southgate, believe it or not, right here. He's a local guy. He grew up in Southgate and worked for the, I want to say, San Diego Chargers. And then he makes his way over, or gets, I guess, nominated to become the NFL commissioner. Again, he's in his early 30s, mind you. So he did several things to help the NFL become popular. Again, many people call him one of the greatest commissioners in the history of sports. Forget just about the NFL, just in the history of sports. So first thing that he does, so he basically gets Congress to change a law. So he convinces Congress to change a law. And that law would become the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. So, and let me take a step back slightly. So Rozelle wanted to negotiate a deal, a collective deal for the entire league. He wanted to create a deal that was similar to the AFL that you see right here. The AFL was a competing league with the NFL. And the AFL had successfully negotiated a deal that was collective, that included all the teams in the league. And so Rozelle wanted to do the same exact thing. But unfortunately, the Congress said that Rozelle could not negotiate a collective deal like that it was antitrust. It was an antitrust violation. And so they said no. And so basically Rozelle lobbies Congress, and Congress creates a new law called the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961, where essentially it enables the NFL to collectively negotiate media deals as a collective group. So again, it allows the NFL, all the teams, to collectively negotiate a media deal as essentially as a trust. And so that was a huge deal. And so this is the reason, by the way, that you only have NFL games on Sundays, and they only play games on Saturdays after the college season ends. This is also the reason why they don't play their games on Fridays, because they don't want to compete against high school games. So there were some things written into the act that still affect the scheduling of NFL games on TV. Any questions on the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 that essentially enables the NFL to collectively negotiate media deals as a trust? Mind you, that in some ways that's breaking the law, even though they made it legal. All right, so the second thing that he did was the AFL NFL merger. So as I already just sort of mentioned, the AFL was a competing league with the NFL, and essentially the AFL was getting pretty popular at the time, and so there was negotiations primarily between a guy by the name of Lamar Hunt. Lamar Hunt used to be the commissioner of the AFL. He was an owner for the Kansas City Chiefs. And this other guy named Tex Schramm. Tex Schramm was the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. And so those two guys essentially largely helped to negotiate the merger that Pete Rozelle oversaw. And so eventually these two teams merge. So the AFL and the NFL merge. They change their names to AFC, NFC, and they become known as the NFL. And so that happened under Pete Rozelle. So the other thing that Rozelle did, and this took a lot of help from a guy by the name of Art Modell. So Art Modell, very important person. So Art Modell. So going back to the merger just very briefly, because it applies to the media revenue sharing deal. So Art Modell, very important person, because in order for the merger to happen, there had to be 3 teams to move to the AFC. And because the way the teams were aligned, there was 10 AFL teams and there was 16 NFL teams. And, the NFL owners, the 16, most of them didn't want to move over to the AFL. And so Rozelle wanted to be an equal divide, right? He wanted each league to be 13 teams. And so Art Modell, who was the owner of the Cleveland Browns, agreed to go over to the AFL as long as a couple of owners would follow him. And that's the reason why the owner of the, I want to say it was the Steelers and the owner of, I want to say the Bengals moved over to the AFL, and it became an equal split of 13 teams. And so because of Modell, the merger happens. Also, media revenue sharing. So Rozelle wanted to create a system where each team got an equal share of the media. So again, each team got an equal share of the media, regardless if you were a good team or a bad team, didn't matter. And so, but that meant that some teams had to give up their current media deals. And at the time, Art Modell of the Cleveland Browns had a very lucrative media deal. And now, mind you, and I know, well, until recently, the Browns were terrible, but the Browns at the time were pretty good. And so the Browns were one of the marquee teams in the league at the time. And so Modell, again, being a good guy, gives up his media deal. And so this enables, again, the league to equally share revenue, regardless if you're a good team or a bad team. Everybody gets an equal share of the revenue. So again, that happened under Pete Rozelle. And again, Art Modell, very important person when it comes to the idea of media revenue sharing. And this is a system that's still done by the NFL today. The AFL-NFL championship game. Again, one of Rozelle's ideas was to create an end of the season championship game between the winner of the AFL and the winner of the NFL. And so this was the original, I believe it was called the AFL-NFL World Championship game. We're a bit hyperbolic in the United States and everything's world here, right? That's why we call it the World Series, those sorts of things. Anyways, so the AFL-NFL Championship game was Rozelle's idea, and the first game was played right here in Los Angeles at the Coliseum, and it was a blowout. And so the first two games were actually blowouts because the Green Bay Packers just had some super dominant teams. And so eventually the AFLs will win the third championship game. And so the name AFL-NFL championship game eventually evolves to the Super Bowl. This is why it's known as the Super Bowl. But the original name was not the Super Bowl. That's important. The original name was not Super Bowl. It becomes retroactively known as the Super Bowl after Super Bowl III, when the New York Jets defeat the Baltimore Colts in Miami for Super Bowl III. Again, many people point to that as being also another turning point in the league. Monday Night Football. One of Rozelle's ideas was to create an event. And he wanted to create an event on Monday. And again, he could televise a game on Monday because there's no college games on Monday. There's no high school games on Monday. So you could place the game on Monday. And so Pete Rozelle, along with the guy by the name of Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge was the head of ABC. And so Roone Arledge and Pete Rozelle got together and they came up with the idea of Monday Night Football to televise a game on Monday. And Monday Night Football was a huge hit on ABC for many years. It's still a hit, but now it's on ESPN. Another one of Pete Rozelle's ideas was to revenue share the gate. So all the ticket sales, it used to be that the teams early on would keep whatever they made from the ticket sales. And so Pete Rozelle said, no, we should share the revenue from the gate, tickets sold, and divvy it up amongst all the different teams. And so he essentially came up with a system of, essentially it's like a 66-33 split, really 60-40, because it's 66-33 split after expenses are paid, but so it's really 60-40. But anyways, Rozelle's idea, which is still utilized by today's NFL, was to revenue share ticket sales, where the home team and the visiting team revenue share. Also, Rozelle creates the idea of NFL properties. NFL properties is the merchandising. So the t-shirts that we wear, the caps that we wear, the jerseys, the pajamas, all those sorts of things. Rozelle's idea was to create a merchandising arm of the NFL, again, revenue share all of this, and divvy it up whether you're a terrible team or a good team, you divvy up the revenue share. The only team that's not a part of NFL properties is the Dallas Cowboys. One last thing that he did, mind you, again, Rozelle did a lot. So he bought NFL Films. So NFL Films was started by Ed Sabol, the guy that you see down here. Ed Sabol started NFL Films. And Ed Sabol started this as sort of like a mom and pop sort of production company where he started to film football games. And eventually, NFL Films decides to buy Ed Sabol's company, and they call it NFL Films. And NFL Films still today produces footage of your favorite team's games. So I'm a fan of the Denver Broncos. They're terrible, but if you watch the end of the season film highlights of the Denver Broncos, you would think they won the Super Bowl, even though they were terrible. And so the NFL Films creates all these different films for all the different teams and the league, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great publicity or marketing arm of the NFL that again was started by Ed Sabol, who started his life working by selling coats, didn't like selling coats, and he was working with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law eventually retires. Ed Sabol sells his father-in-law's coat company and starts a film company that later becomes called the NFL Films. And I guess the moral of the story is with Ed Sabol is you should follow your dreams. Oh yes, the mic'd up segments are great. If you ever watch NFL Films on YouTube, because NFL Films always blocks me because of copyright violations. So they're terrible about that. But anyways, their mic'd up segments are really good. If you ever hear segments about America's team, or if you ever hear the work of John Facenda is known as the voice of God. And so when Facenda narrates NFL Films, it's pretty awesome. So Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers are the team with the most championships. So the NFL, Green Bay Packers, the team with the most championships. Remember, the NFL started in 1920. The Super Bowl, right, really starts in 1967. So, think about, there was a whole history of football that existed before Super Bowl. And so if you count all the championships from pre-Super Bowl and including the Super Bowl, the Green Bay Packers are the most decorated team. They have the most championships. I believe they have 13 championships. So they're the team with the most championships. Now, during the Super Bowl era, the New England Patriots and the Pittsburgh Steelers are both the teams with the most championships during the Super Bowl era. I believe they both have 6. Yes, I believe it started in, I want to say 66, 60. Gosh, was it 66 or 67? I believe it was 67 was the first Super Bowl. Mind you, the Super Bowl was not sold out, by the way. The first one was not. All of you could have, if you were alive back then in 66 or 67, gosh, I can't remember what year exactly. But you could have walked up and bought a ticket, believe it or not. Kind of crazy. So, anyways, moving on to the NBA. So the NBA, George Mikan was the first NBA star. So again, George Mikan, first NBA star. So George Mikan played center, and he played center for the Minneapolis Lakers. And so, if you don't know the history of the LA Lakers, right? They originally started in Minneapolis, and they were called Lakers because obviously, if you've ever been to Minnesota or familiar with Minnesota, it's the state with 1,000 lakes, right? So it makes sense that they would be called Lakers since it's a state with 1,000 lakes. Which doesn't make sense that it's called LA Lakers because we live in a desert, right? Doesn't make sense. Lakers doesn't we have a bunch of man-made lakes here in LA, not natural lakes, if any at all. Anyways, so George Mikan, the first NBA superstar, played center. Because he was such a dominant player, the NBA had to change all sorts of rules. So, for instance, the idea of goaltending, which has anybody ever heard of the phrase goaltending? Has anybody ever heard of the phrase goaltending? Yes. Good. So goaltending essentially means, right, when the ball is on its arc downward, you can't block it. So in the original part of the NBA, that wasn't a rule. And so George Mikan would essentially sit under the basket or be nearby the basket and knock the ball away on its downward slope because he could really jump and he was really tall. He did play center and he was really athletic. And so he would knock the ball away. And so the NBA had to create a goaltending rule because of George Mikan. And also because of George Mikan, they had to expand the lane. They had to widen the lane. Also because of George Mikan. So the lane's even wider now because of George Mikan, but also because of Wilt Chamberlain. But the lane was very narrow in the early parts of basketball history. And to take away George Mikan's effectiveness, they widened the lane even further. And it would happen again when Wilt Chamberlain played. So the first dominant team in the NBA was the Minneapolis Lakers. So the first dominant team was the Minneapolis Lakers, led by the first dominant player, George Mikan. So Danny Biasone probably saved the NBA. So again, Danny Biasone probably saved the NBA. And so does anybody know what Danny Biasone created? So since I don't hear a response, I'll assume it's a no. And so Danny Biasone created the 24-second clock. The 24-second clock. So essentially the team had 24 seconds to shoot the basketball. And so that really helped to speed up the game. 24-second clock is still used in the modern day NBA. And it was created by Danny Biasone. And so going back to George Mikan, just very briefly, teams would hold on to the ball for more than 24 seconds because they didn't want George Mikan to get a hold of the ball. So they would just hold on to the ball and stall. They would use stall tactics to try to win games. And so it got so bad. The NBA got so bad about that games started getting preempted. Okay, Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics have the record for most NBA championships in a row. So that, again, they possess the record for the most NBA championships in a row. Boy, that's a tongue twister. So most NBA championships in a row. They won 8 championships in a row. And they were led, some say, the greatest coach in the history of the NBA. I don't know. Some would say Phil Jackson, but certainly one of the first early great coaches in the NBA was Arnold Red Auerbach. And Auerbach was an interesting guy because, he would light a cigar courtside in the middle of the game just because, his team was going to win. And he was kind of, shoving it in your face. So he would literally, can you imagine nowadays having a coach light up a cigar and start smoking it as the game's ending? So that's what Auerbach would do. And so, but he created the idea of the sixth man being like the first player off the bench to sort of reinvigorate the team. Auerbach created that. He also created the idea of the fast break. So the fast break, if you think about the fast break, I don't know how many of you played basketball, but the fast break, essentially you rush up the court if you get the rebound as fast as possible. And you do that because you can score an easy basket because the defense isn't set up. So Red Auerbach really created the idea of the fast break, of really racing up the court as fast as possible to try to score an easy basket. And he also created the idea of what's called the role player. The role player meaning that you assign a specific role to each player. So for instance, one person might be responsible for just rebounding, right? That's his role. One person might be responsible for scoring. That's his role. One person might be the defensive stopper. So in other words, you place that player on the other team's best player to try to stop him. That's his role. So you would assign roles for players. And so he really was the first coach to really do that. So this is a little bit about Arnold Red Auerbach, who was the coach for the Boston Celtics, who again owned the record for the most consecutive NBA championships in a row.
When Bill Russell joined the Boston Celtics for the 1957 season, Boston would gain the cornerstone for that dynasty. With Russell in the pivot, controlling the backboards and exhibiting unparalleled mobility for a man of his size, the Celtics unleashed a running attack that was perfectly tailored for the up-tempo game. But Russell was not only the catalyst of the offense, he was the anchor of the defense.
He had such great quickness and agility that he could play 3 or 4 guys on the same trip up the court, switch off, go back to his own man, block a shot. So he would disrupt their whole entire offense.
I can remember playing against him in the fourth quarter, and I went in for 4 layups in the fourth quarter. He blocked the first 2, and I missed the next 2 looking for him.
The guy comes in, and you block the shot, and then you go down and you get an easy layup. These things make statements. And then you might look at him and smile and say, yes, we did that to you.
I think Russell was the foxiest, smartest, meanest player psychologically that ever played the game. Whatever it took to win, Russell would do.
If Russell was the foundation of the new Celtics, then Coach Red Auerbach was their visionary architect.
Styles of play have changed too, making for a more aggressive, crowd-pleasing brand of ball. The key to this new style of play is the fast break, where every action is directed to moving the ball into scoring position before the defense has a chance to get set.
The man to whom Auerbach would entrust this new-look offense was Bob Cousy, the unorthodox playmaker who made purists cringe.
Arnold's position was always, hey, you know, you want to pass a little differently or whatever, that's fine as long as it works.
And it usually did, as Cousy proved to be an uncanny passer whose flamboyance did not hinder his accuracy.
If you want somebody to run your fast break, get the rebound and run your fast break, no one did it like Cousy.
With Cousy and Russell, the Celtics possessed the NBA's most spectacular running attack. But Boston's offense was not limited to the fast break. Perennial all-star Bill Sharman gave them deadly perimeter shooting, teaming with Cousy to form the league's best backcourt. While the Tommy gun, Tom Heinsohn, was a high-scoring forward who would take and make shots from all angles. Frank Ramsey gave them instant offense off the bench as one of the game's first sixth men. And with the Joneses in reserve, Sam, the great clutch shooter, and KC, the defensive stopper, Red Auerbach had a team that was loaded with talent and primed to overwhelm even the most formidable opponents.
I had to worry about the Celtics. I didn't have to worry about guarding Bill Russell. I had to worry about Cousy, Ramsey, Heinsohn, Sam Jones, Casey Jones. They had just too many guns.
The Celtics began to hang championship banners with regularity, completely dominating the league. They owed their continued success not only to the players' talent, but also to their unique philosophy.
Red would tell you, you do the job for us, you will be here for your entire career. It was a big deal for a guy to be able to buy a house and live and bring his kids up in a community, all right? It got to the point where everybody believed him, and you would train your replacement. Now, that's unheard of in pro sports, where you would train your replacement because you had this feeling of loyalty to the ball club.
Younger Celtics would eventually supplant their aging mentors, Sam and KC.
So again, Boston Celtics possessed a record for the most championships in a row. They still currently are tied. Well, they're tied now with the Los Angeles Lakers for the most NBA championships. So Spencer Haywood versus the NBA. I'm going to assume that I almost asked this question. Does common law ever talk about Supreme Court cases that center on sports or entertainment? I should say sports since we're on sports. Okay. Okay, fair enough. No. Fair enough. So Spencer Haywood versus the NBA. So an important Supreme Court case. So a little bit about Spencer Haywood. Spencer Haywood was grew up, was a poor kid. I believe he had, I don't know how many, I remember how many siblings he had. He had several siblings. He was growing up with a single mom. And so he ends up going off to playing college basketball. But he only plays, I believe, one season, maybe two. Then he goes off to play in the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968. And then he gets drafted to go play for the ABA, which we haven't talked about yet. And so then shortly thereafter, he gets drafted into the NBA. And the NBA says essentially that he cannot play for an NBA team because he was too young. And so this court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And essentially the court rules in Spencer Haywood's favor. And so essentially what this court case allows or enables, it enables a basketball player to join the league early. In other words, they don't have to play 4 years of college basketball to join the NBA. So again, they don't have to play 4 years of college basketball to join the NBA. So in other words, if you were good enough, right, you could leave straight as soon as you graduated from high school, you could join the NBA. So if you think about the late great Kobe Bryant, or if you think about LeBron James, the reason they were able to join the NBA straight out of high school, as soon as, just they played their 4 years of high school, they jumped straight into the NBA. It's because of the Spencer Haywood case. Now, the NBA's changed the rules now, and now you have something called one and done, where essentially you can play 1 year of college basketball before you join the NBA. But because of Spencer Haywood, these guys can essentially, they don't have to play 4 years of college. They can essentially jump nowadays after 1 year of playing college basketball straight to organized professional basketball. So again, the Spencer Haywood case, Spencer Haywood wins, and essentially enables players to join the league early before they don't have to play 4 years of college basketball. So NBA, ABA. So the American Basketball Association was the competitor to the National Basketball Association. And the ABA played this high energy type of basketball game, very exciting. And they had a tricolored basketball, red, white, and blue. They had, some big time stars that played in the ABA, like for instance, Dr. J, who is known as Julius Erving, probably the best player of the ABA. So they also had something called the three-point line, which is now very common in today's NBA game, the three-point line. The NBA did not have a three-point line. They got that rule, or they got that from the ABA. The ABA had the three-point line to have more excitement, more scoring, and so eventually it makes its way over to the NBA. Slam dunk competitions, which were a big deal at one point in time for NBA All-Star games. That also started with the ABA. The ABA had these really cool All-Star game competitions, and eventually the NBA borrows that. And so another thing that happened was 4 teams were allowed to merge. Not every single team was allowed to merge into the NBA. The NBA only allowed for 4 teams to merge from the ABA. Those 4 teams were the San Antonio Spurs, the Indiana Pacers, Denver Nuggets, New Jersey Nets, which are now called the Brooklyn Nets. And so those were the 4 teams that were allowed to join the league. There was another team called the Spirits of St. Louis. The Spirits of St. Louis thought they were going to be able to join the league. They were not allowed, but they were able to sign a sweetheart deal with the NBA. And so essentially they were getting 2/4 of the revenue that was being collected by the Spurs, the Pacers, the Nuggets, and the Nets. So the owners of the St. Louis Spirits, who never became part of the NBA team, were getting paid royalty checks by the NBA for years. I think they made like $800 million over there until the NBA decided to stop paying them. I mean, I think, yeah, it was like $800 million for years. They were getting paid. The Spirits of St. Louis. Anyways, so Oscar Robertson versus the NBA, another Supreme Court case. So the merger was going to happen sooner, but it took a long time for the merger to happen because Oscar Robertson was a great basketball player for the NBA and essentially takes the NBA to court over free agency. The NBA players were not given free agency. Free agency meaning that you're free to join any team possible. It wasn't allowed. And so the Oscar Robertson took the NBA to court, and this court case never gets settled, mind you. It goes all the way to Supreme Court, doesn't ever really truly get settled. They settle it out of court, where essentially the NBA says, fine, we'll allow limited, right, free agency to the players. And so Oscar Robertson says, okay, that's fine. Limited meaning that essentially the players have, the team has first right of refusal. In other words, if the player wants to become a free agent, they have to, that only could happen if the NBA team says no, then, and if the NBA team wasn't willing to match a deal by another team. So it was limited free agency. It wasn't true free agency. What time is it? I know I'm talking a lot. Okay, so LA Lakers. LA Lakers are important for two very reasons. Number one being that them, along with the Celtics, have the most NBA championships. They both have, I believe now, 17 championships. The LA Lakers also possess the record for the longest winning streak in NBA history. So again, LA Lakers, longest winning streak in NBA history. I believe they won 33 games in a row, and they were led by the guy underneath here named Wilt Chamberlain. So this is a clip about the 1971, 1972 LA Lakers.
Though they had reached the finals 7 of the last 9 years, each trip had ended in agonizing defeat.
It was the most disgusting personal period I've ever had in my life. I wanted to win a championship, and I really didn't think that was ever going to happen.
With Elgin Baylor's retirement prior to the 1972 season, it began to look like time had passed the aging Lakers by.
Now I'm playing with a Laker team that has the great Jerry West, who was in his twilight, and Wilt Chamberlain, who was in his twilight, and Gail Goodrich, as far as was the star of the team, and names that you would not even know. I can't even tell you who the heck they were. You understand? We did not have this awesome talent.
Now a less overpowering team, these Lakers would have to redefine their roles. And newly appointed captain Wilt Chamberlain would lead the way.
I was now the defensive hub of this team, and that was what my job was all about, getting the ball and playing defense and giving the ball to these guys. So it just kind of all worked out really, really well. And as we meshed, we amassed numbers that were unbelievable.
Playing off Wilt, the other Lakers were each at the top of their games, and none flourished more than Goodrich and West, combining to score over 52 points per game. They made the Lakers almost impossible to stop.
All of a sudden, this team started winning basketball games. And we went along and went along and went along. 1 month went by, 2 months went by.
When you get to 17, 18, 19 wins, now people are saying, like, wow, can they ever lose?
Piling up victory after victory, the Lakers became more cohesive with every game.
We did everything the way the coach wanted, and everything worked for us. And it got to be almost funny because we knew no one could beat us. I mean, we felt invincible.
For 33 straight contests, the Lakers were invincible as they compiled a modern-day sports record win streak. They would go on to win 69 regular season games, the most in NBA history. But the Laker veterans knew that the postseason would be their time of judgment.
I always felt that Wilt, in some respects, has gotten a bum rap for not winning more championships. Wilt Chamberlain, like Jerry West, was probably the best runner-up in most occasions.
Despite their magnificent season, these Lakers knew that if they failed to lift their finals X, they would be remembered only as losers. As they had in 1970, they would face the Knicks. But this year, there would be no miracle upsets. The Lakers were also Rands no longer, dispatching New York in 5 games. They would go down in history as one of the NBA's greatest winners.
Goodrich passes under to Wilt. He's got it. He puts it up and slam dunks it.
This was something that I'd hoped and wished for in the earlier days of my career. It was wonderful. We finally won.
For that Laker team to do what they did, I still think that they did more in the game of basketball than any other team for the talent that they had.
So again, the 1971-72 Lakers possessed the record for the longest winning streak in the history of the NBA, winning 33 straight games. Pretty remarkable. Of course, they don't possess the best record in the history of the NBA anymore. The Warriors, Golden State Warriors, have the best record in the history of the NBA. Wilt Chamberlain. He's important for a couple of reasons, but the most important because he's the only player in the history of the NBA to score 100 points in a game. So again, he's the only player in the history of the NBA to score 100 points in a single game. Kobe Bryant came close. I think he scored 82. But Wilt Chamberlain again is the person who's the only person in the history of the NBA to score 100 points by himself in an NBA game. Michael Jordan, many people call him the best player in the history of the NBA. Yeah, probably, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But most certainly the person that helped the NBA become a global sport. He took it to a whole different level, and probably the most famous endorser in terms of an athlete in the history of sports, probably. And so Michael Jordan, very important figure in the history of the NBA, just in terms of helping the sport become a global sport, largely because of Jordan, and also because if you think about the Dream Team, the original Dream Team with Jordan, right, pretty important. David Stern, the late, great David Stern, who just also recently passed away. So very important because he's really the person that helped to negotiate significant media deals that's brought lots of money into the NBA. He also introduced the idea of a salary cap. So salary cap meaning that the teams, well, in the NBA, they have a soft salary cap. So meaning that you could go over a set dollar amount to sign a star player. But David Stern really is the first person to introduce the idea of a salary cap. In other words, the collective salaries of all the players can't exceed a certain number. It could be a hard cap or it can be a soft cap. In the case of the NBA with David Stern, it was a soft cap. And he also introduced the idea of a dress code. So David Stern wanted to bring in more corporate sponsors, and he thought or felt that the NBA had a poor reputation because guys would show up to the game just wearing sweatsuits and those sorts of things. So David Stern essentially implemented a dress code where people had to wear suits or the tie. And so a lot of players were not happy with David Stern for doing that, but it did help bring in more corporate money. So how is sports different than other businesses in general? And so essentially sports is different than other businesses in the United States because they are able to negotiate media deals together. So again, they're able to negotiate media deals together. Imagine, right? Warner Brothers, Disney, Universal, Sony, and all these big studios saying, hey, you know, you want to negotiate as a cartel the price of our television commercials, how much you charge us. It would never fly, right? And so it's interesting that our government allows sports to negotiate as a trust, things like media deals. And so, which they revenue share. Which again, the idea of revenue sharing is also very unique to sports. They also share their merchandising revenue, generally speaking, although some athletes can opt out. And one team has opted out, which is the Dallas Cowboys, but they revenue share merchandising revenue. They also revenue share, and this applies to Major League Baseball, NBA, hockey does this. The NFL does this, by the way, I just didn't point it out. They also share local revenue. They also share sponsorship revenue. It's one of the few things where other owners and the commissioner have to vote you in, which is interesting. Player and team movement is limited or restricted, which is also kind of unique because any one of you, let's just say that, upon your graduation, you get a cool job, but then you get a better offer. Within 6 months, you can go ahead and move if you want to. But not in sports. In sports, you're binded by the team until your contract ends. And team movement is very much limited. You got to pay a huge fee to move a team. And it's, for the most part, it's restricted. And so one player that tried to test the idea again of the reserve clause was the Toolson versus Yankees court case. And this court case also makes its way to the Supreme Court. So Toolson was a great pitcher. Well, wasn't great. He was a pitcher for the New York Yankees. He was pretty good, but he could not make his way into the starting lineup. And so basically wants to get traded, basically wants to become a free agent, feels like the Yankees are hindering his ability to make a living, make money. And this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And again, the Yankees win. So the reserve clause stays. And also, this was a court case that tested the Federal League versus the New York Yankees, which enabled baseball to remain a monopoly. So again, Major League Baseball wins again, or the Yankees win this Supreme Court case, essentially trying to end the reserve clause. Taxpayers. So one of the things that I find very unique about sports is that us poor folks or middle class folks or working class folks pay for these venues that where billionaires make money and millionaires play on the field. So I find it very odd that we as working folks are willing to pay for these multi-million-dollar or heck multi-billion-dollar venues where millionaires and billionaires make even more money, and we pay for it. So whenever you hear it's being publicly funded, that means us taxpayers pay for it. Now, in the case of the arena here in Inglewood, I believe that's all being privately funded. So that's a good thing by the LA Rams owner. So also one of the few things is owners and managers are high profile people. So which I think is interesting because there are people who own like oil companies who make billions of dollars. There are folks that own, for instance, some of these large media conglomerates that are, outside of entertainment folks. We don't really know them. But owners and managers are high profile people, right? It's interesting, that these managers are, sort of famous. And these owners are sort of famous because they manage a sports team or because they own a sports team, which is very unique. Okay, so I'm only probably going to finish one column because we're already at the end of class. My God, time flies. So there is this very tight relationship or synergistic relationship between sports and media now. It wasn't always seen that way. Sports owners were very, at least in the beginning stages, were very leery of media, primarily because they felt like media was going to hurt their business. And so it's interesting how this relationship has evolved over the years because it wasn't always perceived that way. So anyways, on the sports side, right, obviously now owners of sports teams see media as this gigantic revenue stream, right? When you get media exposure, it provides these sports owners with tons of money. It is now the number one revenue stream for these major sports leagues. Now, also on the sporting side, sports now has the ability to produce and distribute their own content. And so, again, right, in the beginning, in the early days of sports, sports owners didn't want even media coverage. So it's now interesting that now sports owners want to produce and distribute their own content. And so now they've created their own individual networks. So there's now a hockey network, there's a baseball network, there is a football network, there's a basketball network. These sports teams have their own individual networks now. And so it's just interesting that it's evolved to that. And so now sports owners use media to build fan bases. And so, for instance, the more media exposure that you have, the better branding your team's going to have, because generally speaking, the reason that you receive more media exposure, especially if you think about the NFL, is because your team is better. So the media likes to expose the teams that are successful. Sports owners now, especially the merchandising arm of sports owners, like to use media to increase merchandising sales by changing their uniforms or changing their logos. And so this creates an opportunity for the team to make even more money off of merchandising. They'll utilize the idea nowadays of retro, right? Retro uniforms, they'll pull out their old uniforms from back in the day to generate more sales of merchandising. And also nowadays, if you think about especially the venues and the idea of coverage, sponsors know that because they're attached, either local sponsors or national sponsors, they're attached to this particular sports team or sports league, it's going to generate more revenue for that sponsor. So that you're seeing a growth now of naming rights, but on jerseys, or sponsorship rights on jerseys. So it's now starting to look a lot like, I don't know how familiar you are with international soccer, where they have, jersey sponsors. That's already a thing here in the United States. And so that's going to keep growing, I think, moving forward. Don't be surprised if you start seeing multiple sponsors on jerseys. And also ad revenue. So media sports is using sponsors to place all the billboards all over the stadium. When I was a kid in the early days of Dodger Stadium, well, not that old, but when I used to go to Dodger Stadium when I was a kid, the blue walls on Dodger Stadium, or even an Anaheim Stadium, it was a wall, right? There was no advertisements on the walls. It was just a wall. There was very few advertisements all over the stadiums. But if you decide to go to a baseball game nowadays, now that it seems like they're going to open up the venues, but if you see a game right on TV, or if you go to the venue, you'll see sponsorships or advertisements all over the stadium. They'll have contests that center around a specific sponsor. But anyways, the point that I'm trying to make is that sports uses its media coverage to increase its sponsorship revenue. So I won't go on to the media side because I think it's already 12:45. Man, hour and 50 minutes is just not long enough. Thank you. And I'll also I'll forward today, right now, as a matter of fact, as soon as I finish talking to you, I will forward you Sal's email address, which I thought I did, but anyways, it doesn't matter.